The last thing I remember clearly from those few seconds is the sound the ice made when it went. Not a crack, exactly. More like a sigh, the way old wood settles at night in a cold house. One soft, resigned sound, and then I was in the water, and the water was taking everything away from me very fast. I have told this story twice in full. Once to my daughter Norma, late on a February night, when she drove up and sat with me at the kitchen table and wouldn't leave until I'd eaten something. Once to you, right now. If you want to understand what happened out on that pond and what I found the following morning at the dock post, I need to go back to the week Delia died, 14 months before any of this, because none of it makes sense without her, and none of it makes sense without the bread. Delia Ruth Ramsey died on a Thursday in late November, 14 months before the February I'm describing. It was a short illness as those things go, 8 weeks from the first scan to the last morning. She was 58 years old and had walked our pond trail every single day for 11 years, since the year we got Cobb, and she never missed a day even in the worst January cold we'd had up here. She'd wrap a wool scarf around her head until only her eyes showed, and she'd go out there in her barn boots, and she'd walk the loop around the pond with that old beagle toddling behind her, and she'd come back in smelling like cold air and looking satisfied with herself. I retired from the rural mail route the spring before she got sick. 31 years on that route, which covered about 68 miles of gravel and frost-heaved county road depending on the season, and I knew every ice condition on every low section of every road from the 1st of December to the middle of March. I knew what 2-inch ice sounded like underfoot. I knew what a melt shadow on an east-facing bank meant for the surface below it. I had driven across frozen creek crossings in the dark before the counties put culverts in, and I had never once gone through. I want to be clear about that because what happened in February needs that context. I was not a careless man on ice. There was a stretch of the route, the eastern leg out past the Lutheran cemetery, that ran along a low bottom where Pikes Creek crossed under the road through a pair of corrugated culverts that froze solid by Christmas most years. The road there sat on a low fill, and water came up under it in the warm spells and refroze flat on top of the gravel by morning. You could not see it from the cab. You could only feel it, a small lift under the steering when the wheels lost the grit and rode the slick. And you learned to take that section in second gear with both hands on the wheel and your foot off the brake. There was a winter, I want to say 1996, when the bottom flooded twice in the same week, and the second freeze laid down a sheet of black ice from the cattle guard at Holcomb's Lane all the way to the bridge. I was 3 days into delivering the new federal forms that had to be signed for, and I had a bag of certifieds in the seat next to me. And at 6 a.m. on the third day, I hit that stretch and felt the truck go light, and my supervisor's voice came over the radio asking for a status from the eastern leg, and I keyed the mic and said, holding on at the moment, "We'll report at the bridge," and I let the truck slide the last 40 feet on its own line, because that is what you do. You do not fight the slide, you ride it down. I made the bridge, and I made the rest of the route. And at the end of the day, I told dispatch the eastern leg needed a sand truck before the morning run, and they sent one. That was the kind of thing I knew, not from a manual, from the feel of a half-ton Jeep losing weight under the wheel on a county road. I had been driving for 15 winters by then. Old man Holcomb came out to the road that afternoon when I came back through, 90 years old and standing in his coveralls with a thermos of coffee in his hand, and he said, "You all right out there?" I said, "Fine, Mr. Holcomb." He said, "My dad always said the eastern leg gets you in February if you are not paying attention." And I said, "Yes, sir. Your dad was correct." He said, "You are paying attention." I said, "I try to be." He nodded and walked back up the lane, and I went on. He died the next summer. I delivered the funeral notices to half the township that July. I mention all of this because what I'm about to tell you about the pond in February sounds like the kind of thing that happens to a man who is not paying attention, and I want it on the record that I had spent 31 years paying attention to exactly the conditions that put me in the water that day. I knew what melt shadow ice looked like. I knew the angle of light on an east-facing bank in the second week of February. I knew the difference between 4 inches of clear blue ice and 4 inches of grey ice with air laced through it. I had walked sections of frozen pond as recently as the previous February to retrieve a piece of pipe that had gotten away from me, and I had come off the ice in the place I had walked onto it, the way a man does. None of that helped on the morning I am going to describe. The thing I learned that morning is that paying attention for 31 years buys you fewer guarantees than you think it does. It buys you 1 bad step instead of 3, maybe. It does not buy you 0. The other thing those years on the route bought me was a way of reading a property without thinking about it. My own 40 acres I had walked daily for 22 winters by the time Delia got sick, and I knew the pond the way I knew the cab of my truck. I knew which low spot at the south fence line held water until the second hard freeze, and which one drained by Thanksgiving. I knew which of the hemlocks lost a top branch every other January, and where it tended to land. I knew the place on the north bank where a vein of clay came near the surface and held the last of the day's heat into the early evening, so the snow there was always thinner by an inch or 2 than the snow 10 feet either direction. I knew where the deer came through the back fence on their way to bed, down in the cedar bottom, and I knew the time of year a young buck would rub the maple sapling at the bottom of the lower pasture. None of that knowledge had a use I could name on a tax return. It was the inheritance of paying attention to one piece of ground for a long enough stretch of years that the ground started telling you things back. That was the kind of attention I had brought to the property, and that was the kind of attention I had stopped bringing to it after Delia died. And I want to be honest that some of what happened that February was a function of the second part as much as the first. A man who has stopped looking at his own land closely is a man who has stopped noticing what has begun to look back. After Delia passed, I kept putting the bread heel out on the dock post each morning. She had started that habit years ago, for the jays. She said blue jays were too proud to beg at a proper feeder, but they'd take what looked like it had just been left there by accident. She was probably right about that. So every morning she'd pull the end piece off whatever loaf we had and walk the 80 yards from the house down to the pond dock and set it on top of the post, flat side down, and she'd stand there a minute looking at the water before she came back in. I kept doing it after she was gone. I'm not entirely sure why. It wasn't a decision I made. It was more that the habit continued without her, the way some habits do, and stopping it would have required a decision I couldn't quite bring myself to make. What I am sure of is that Cobb kept doing his part too. 11 years old by then, grey around his muzzle and moving slower up the hill than he used to, but he'd still follow me down the trail each morning when I went. He'd sit at the base of the dock and watch the water while I set the bread out, and then we'd go back to the house. That was the circuit. It replaced Delia's morning walk in a reduced form, just the 80 yards down and the 80 yards back, and I told myself that was enough. The pond trail itself I had stopped maintaining. Delia had loved that loop, the full 3/4-mile circuit around the water, and she'd kept it clear herself with a set of loppers she hung on a nail inside the barn door. After she was gone, I let the brush come in on the east side, where the trail ran through the hemlock stand, and the light was always thin. I told myself I'd clear it in spring. Spring came, and I let it go again. By the time the following autumn arrived, that section of trail was shoulder-high in alder scrub, and I hadn't walked it once. Norma called every 2 weeks or so through that first winter and into the spring. She lived about 2 hours south, had her own work and her own family, and she called the way you call a person you are worried about but cannot quite reach. The calls were short, because I made them short, not out of rudeness, but out of the honest recognition that I did not have anything to say. She would ask how I was eating, and I would say, fine. She would ask if I needed anything, and I would say no. She would ask if I'd thought about coming down for a weekend, and I would say maybe in the spring. Spring came, and I didn't go. She stopped asking about it after a while, and the calls got shorter, and then there was a stretch in October where I realized I'd let her last 2 calls go to the machine. I'm not proud of that. I want to say it plainly. I was not trying to push her away. I was trying to get from one day to the next without making it worse. And somehow, that became the same thing. By mid-January of that following February, I had settled into a specific routine that I can describe in about 3 lines. I got up at 5:30. I made 1 cup of coffee. I put the bread on the dock post, walked back to the house, fed Cobb, and spent the rest of the day doing the kind of maintenance that needs doing on a rural property in winter, whether or not anyone has the heart for it. Firewood, gutters, the truck's alternator which had been throwing a slow drain all November. Useful work. The kind that doesn't require you to feel anything. That was the winter I stopped putting 2 plates on the table at dinner time. I mention it not for sentiment's sake, but because I want you to understand the specific shape of that season. There's a difference between missing a person and rearranging your kitchen around the fact that they are gone. And I was doing the second thing. The kettle I moved to the back burner because Delia always used the front one. The chair I had started sitting in was hers, not mine, because it faced the window over the sink, and I had noticed at some point that the light came in there a certain way in the late afternoon that I found tolerable. Those are the sorts of adjustments a man makes when he is trying to get through. The bread heels started disappearing before dawn, sometime in the 2nd week of January. I noticed it because I was up early on account of the alternator work, and I looked out the kitchen window toward the pond at first light, and the post was empty. The heel I'd set out the evening before, which I had started doing some mornings when it was too cold to walk down before sunrise, was gone. Not taken by jays, because jays don't work in the dark. Crow, maybe. That was my first thought. Crows will work in very low light if they're hungry enough, and January is a lean month for them. So I watched for 2 mornings. Nothing. On the 3rd morning, I got up at 4:15 and sat in the cold kitchen with the lights off and watched through the window. I watched for 40 minutes. No crow, no jay, no movement at all at the post, and when the sun came up enough to see by, the heel was gone. I had not seen anything take it. I told myself it was a coyote on the ice. That was my second explanation. A coyote can cover ground silently, and it's lean enough in deep winter to take something off a post if it can reach. A large coyote might manage a post that height with a stretch. The problem with that was the post is smooth painted cedar and stands about 4 feet off the dock decking, which puts the top at roughly 5.5 feet above the ice, and coyotes don't jump straight up onto skinny posts. I knew that the moment I said it to myself, but I held on to it for another couple of days because it was the last explanation I had that fit inside the world I knew. Around the same time, Cobb started doing something I had not seen him do before. Each evening at dusk, he'd walk to the edge of the yard where the grass ended and the slope down to the pond began, and he'd sit there. Ears up, not barking, not low grumbling the way he did when he spotted a deer at the fence line. Just sitting and looking toward the hemlock stand on the east side of the pond with his nose going. He'd stay there 15 minutes, sometimes 20, and then he'd come back to the porch and scratch to come in. I watched him do this for 4 evenings running. Old beagles don't hold still without a reason. He was tracking something his nose had found, and whatever it was didn't alarm him. That was the part I kept coming back to. Cobb had a perfectly serviceable alarm, and he wasn't using it. I want to be honest about what I thought at that point. I thought it was interesting. I thought it was one of those winter mysteries that rural properties produce and then quietly resolve, the way a noise in the wall turns out to be a squirrel who worked his way out on his own, or a fence section you thought needed replacing. Turns out to be fine when the frost comes off the ground. I was not afraid. I was not expecting anything. I was a 61-year-old man in a hard season, and I had enough of my own problems without borrowing new ones from the hemlock stand. The first week of February, I found the depressions in the crusted snow along the eastern bank. I had gone down to check the dockboards, which I'd been meaning to do since a warm stretch in late January had put some water on top of the ice and then refrozen. The east bank is where the pond gets into the hemlock shadow, and I knew from experience that the ice there ran thinner than the open water sections. I walked the bank with a long-handled shovel, testing ahead of me the way I'd always done on the route when I had to walk a low section to see if it was passable. Professional habit. The kind that stays. What I found stopped me completely. There were 4 of them in a loose line, spaced far apart, running from the tree line to the bank's edge and then back again. Each one was roughly twice the length of my own boot, maybe a little more, and pressed deep enough into the crusted surface that, whatever made them, had been carrying serious weight. The crust was hard enough that I left almost no impression with my own boot unless I jumped in place, which I tried once to see. My impression was maybe a 1/4 inch. These went down nearly 2 inches. I stood there a long time. I am the kind of man who has spent his entire adult life refusing to make claims he cannot back up, and I stood at those depressions for a while and went through everything I knew. Bear would be denned. Elk don't come this far into the lowland timber at this time of year, and their track shape is wrong in any case. These were not hooves. These were not paw prints. The shape was wrong for everything I had a name for. Too long and too broad, and the toe impression, where the snow had caught it cleanly enough to show, was not claw. I walked back to the house and ate lunch, and came back and looked again. They were still there. The snow hadn't shifted them. I measured the spacing between the depressions with a tape measure I had in my coat pocket, because I had been doing fence work that morning and hadn't emptied it. The step length was about 5.5 feet. That night, I did not sleep well. Not from fear exactly. More from the low, unsettled feeling of a man whose categories have stopped accounting for the available evidence. I had been on that property for 22 years, and I knew every animal that used the pond and the hemlock stand. I had found deer beds, otter slides, mink tracks along the bank in winter. I had found evidence of a black bear taking apart a downed log near the fence line 3 summers in a row. I had seen all of it. I had a name for all of it. I did not have a name for this. On February 8th, a Tuesday, I went down to the pond just after 8 in the morning with the intention of retrieving Delia's trail marker stake. She had put it in herself the autumn before she got sick, hammering it into the soft ground at the point where the trail bent around the far side of the pond, in the spot that was hardest to follow in the low winter light. Orange surveying tape on top, the kind that rattles a little in the wind so you can hear the path when you can't quite see it. I had meant to pull it last spring and hadn't. I had meant to pull it the spring after that and hadn't. It had stood through 2 full winters at the pond's east bend, and every time I walked down to the dock, I could see the orange tape from the house if the light was right, and I always found a reason not to go get it. That morning, I found myself down on the dock with the bread heel set, looking across the ice at the stake standing on the far bank, and I decided that was the day. I am not sure what shifted. Something had. The main ice was solid. I crossed to the centre without any concern, testing ahead as I went with the shovel handle, and the sound it returned was good, the solid clunk of thick ice 4 or more inches down. I was about 2/3 of the way across when I angled toward the east bank to come up on the stake from the pond side instead of walking around through the alder brush. I took 3 steps off the center track. The ice made that sound, the soft, resigned sound I described at the start. And then I was in the water. What I can tell you about the next 60 seconds or so is partial, and I want to be honest about that. The water was the kind of cold that doesn't feel cold at first. It feels like pressure, like the whole world pushing against your chest from the outside. I had gone in at an angle and my right shoulder hit bottom, which meant it was shallow enough that I was not going to drown immediately. But the ice at the hole's edge was not holding when I tried to get an arm on it, and the bank was a good 8 or 10 feet away through broken surface ice. I know I got a hand on the shovel because I had not let it go. What I do not know precisely is the next part. I know that I was pulled, not lifted exactly. Pulled is the right word. Something at my left shoulder and the back of my coat collar, steady and very deliberate, moving me toward the bank and not stopping until I was clear of the water and on the frozen mud at the edge. I did not see what was behind me. My eyes were on the bank trying to find something solid to reach for. By the time I had turned and gotten myself sitting upright, whatever had been behind me was gone. I sat on the bank for a while. I'm not sure how long. Long enough that my coat had started to stiffen in the cold. I looked at the tree line. I looked at the hemlock stand. I looked at the ice and the hole and the shovel lying 4 feet out from the bank where it had come to rest. I did not call out. I don't know why. It simply did not occur to me. I walked back to the house. I stripped the wet clothes in the mudroom and stood under the shower until the shaking stopped, which took longer than I expected. I made coffee. I sat in Delia's chair by the window and watched the pond for the rest of the afternoon while the light changed, and I did not see anything move. Cobb sat at my feet the whole time, which was something he did when he thought I needed company and wasn't asking for it. That was the night I understood something had been watching this property for some time, and I understood it was not watching it like a threat watches a thing. The following morning, February 9th, I went down to the dock before 7. I had been awake since 4:30, which was not unusual for me that winter. I put my coat on over 2 wool shirts and my insulated work pants, and I walked the 80 yards down to the pond in the dark, with a flashlight and Cobb moving slow behind me. I was not entirely sure what I expected to find. I was not entirely sure why I was going down there before full light. Some part of me already knew. The bread heel from the day before was still on the post. That was the first thing the flashlight found. Still there, which was strange, because it was always gone by the time I came down. Whatever had been taking them before dawn had not taken this one. Beside it, on the flat top of the post, placed with some care, was a piece of birch bark roughly the size of my palm, folded once, and on top of that was a short length of orange surveying tape. I stood there for a long time. Long enough that Cobb came and sat on my left boot the way he does sometimes in cold weather, and I didn't move him. The surveying tape was the same type Delia had used on her trail marker stake. Orange plastic, the rattling kind, cut to about 8 inches. The birch bark was fresh enough that it hadn't dried out, which meant it had been placed there in the night, within the last few hours at most. I had not put it there. I looked at the tree line. The hemlocks stood still in the early dark. No wind, nothing moving. The pond ice was undisturbed except for the broken section on the east side, where the hole had begun to refreeze overnight into a rough grey crust. I reached out and picked up the orange tape. It was cold and a little stiff in my fingers. I stood there holding it, and I will tell you honestly that I am not a man who cries without a fight, but I fought that one and lost. Not loudly. Not in a way Cobb seemed concerned about. just standing there at the dock post in the cold dark with a piece of orange plastic tape in my hand, losing a fight I'd been winning for 14 months. I don't know what it was, and I have stopped requiring myself to know. What I know is what it did. It pulled me out of the water when the water would have had me if I'd been alone out there, which I had been every day of that winter without incident or event, because I am a careful man on ice who made one bad angle on a melt shadow and paid for it in the standard way. And then it went to the dock post that same night, in the dark, and it left the bread where it was and put something beside it that connected directly to the thing I had been unable to go get for 2 full years. Delia's steak. The orange tape on her trail marker that I had walked past every morning without going to retrieve it, because going to retrieve it would mean the trail was over. That was what it was about. I understood that standing at the dock post with the tape in my hand. The trail was something I had left unfinished because finishing it felt like agreeing that she was gone, and some part of me had been refusing to agree. The creature, whatever it was, did not show itself again that morning. I looked toward the hemlock stand for a long time. I looked at the eastern bank where the depressions were still visible in the crusted snow. I looked at the dock post, at the birch bark, at the bread heel still sitting there undisturbed. Then I walked back to the house, and I sat at the table and I called my daughter. Norma picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been worrying. Dad. That was how she answered. Just my name. Or not even my name, just what I was to her, stated plainly. I said, "Hey, Norma." And then I didn't say anything for a moment. She waited. She has always been better at waiting than I am. I said, "I wondered if you might want to come up this weekend." A pause from her. Then, yes. I'll come up Friday night. I'll make something, I said. You don't have to make anything. I want to, I said, and I meant it, which was the first time in 14 months that I had meant a thing like that. She drove up that Friday in a light snow, and we sat at the table until almost midnight. I told her most of it, not all of it. I told her about the bread heels disappearing. I told her about the depressions in the snow. I told her about going through the ice and getting out. I told her about what I'd found at the dock post the next morning. The birch bark, the orange tape. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which took some doing on her part, because Norma is not a quiet person by nature. When I finished, she sat with it for a while, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "What do you think it was?" she said finally. "I don't know," I said. "Something that's been here a while, I think. Something that was paying attention." She looked at the window toward where the pond was in the dark. "Mum would have loved that," she said. I thought about it. "Yeah," I said. "She would have." The weekend Norma came, I put on my coat the first morning and walked down to the dock the way I always did. And after I set the bread heel on the post, I kept going. Around the south side of the pond on the section that was still clear, and then into the alders on the east side where I'd let the trail go. I had a pair of loppers with me, the same ones from the nail inside the barn door. I worked for about 2 hours, clearing back to the hemlock bend. The ground was frozen hard enough that the root trimming went quickly. I found the stake where it had stood through 2 winters. The orange tape faded, but still there, still rattling faintly when I touched it. I pulled it gently, straight up, and carried it back to the barn. After that, I walked the full loop with Norma. It took us about 40 minutes because the east section was still a little rough in places, and we went slowly. Cobb came along, moving at his own pace, nose to the ground in the hemlock section like he was reading something the rest of us couldn't see. We didn't talk much. The pond looked different from that angle from the east bank where the trail ran through the hemlocks, bigger than it looked from the house. The sky above the water was pale blue with thin clouds moving south. That was the first time I'd walked the full loop since Delia died. I went back to the trail every morning after that with Cobb, rain or clear, and when the path needed maintenance, I did it. When the loppers needed sharpening, I sharpened them. I put the bread heel on the post each morning before the walk, and for a while in late February and into March, it kept disappearing the way it had before January turned, taken before dawn by whatever came in the dark. Then, sometime in March, it stopped disappearing. The jays found it again and took it in the usual way, in daylight, and that was the end of that pattern. I never saw anything again at the tree line that I couldn't name. Cobb stopped doing his evening vigils at the yard's edge sometime in early spring, just stopped one evening and didn't go back. Whatever he had been listening for had apparently moved on, or finished what it had come to do. I don't know which. I have my suspicion, but I hold it loosely. The depressions in the snow along the east bank lasted until the big melt in the third week of February. And then they were gone. I had not photographed them. This is not something I regret exactly. Some evidence is not meant to be archived. It is meant to be stood in front of. And I stood in front of it. And that was enough. By the time the snow was fully off the ground and the pond was open water again, I had called Norma 3 times just to talk, not about anything in particular. She started telling me things about her week again, the ordinary small things she had stopped telling me when I'd stopped being able to receive them, and I listened, and I was glad to listen. She asked once if I wanted her to come back up for a weekend, and I said yes, and she did, and we walked the trail together again in early April when the redbuds were just starting. The following October, a full 8 months after February, I went down to the dock one morning at just past 6. I'd gotten back into the habit of going early before the light was full, the way I had done with the route for 31 years. There is something about low morning light on still water that I had forgotten I needed, and I had been given it back, and I was not careless with it. I set the bread heel on the post and stood there looking at the pond. The water was flat and dark, the way it gets in October just before the surface temperature drops enough to start putting out morning mist. The hemlock stand on the east side had gone dark green the way hemlocks do in fall while everything around them is turning. The trail was clear all the way around. I had kept it up through the summer, which had not been hard once I'd gotten started. Cobb was at my left heel. He was slower than he had been even in February, a little more deliberate with his back legs on the slope down from the house, and I'd been watching him the way you watch an old dog when you know the arithmetic is starting to change. He was 11 years old and had been walking this property his whole life, every acre of it. He sniffed at the base of the dock post and then sat beside my boot and looked out at the water the same way I did. I stood there long enough to watch the light change. It came from the east, low and flat the way October mornings have it up here in the upper Midwest, and it caught the water and the hemlock stand and the last yellow leaves on the paper birches along the north bank, and for a while everything was lit from one side in a way that made it look like a place you would remember. I thought about Delia. I think about Delia every morning, and I expect that will not change. But that October morning at the dock, I thought about her the way you think about a person when you are glad they existed rather than gutted that they are gone. And I noticed the difference. It had taken a long time to get there. I had not gotten there alone. I had tied Delia's orange trail tape to the post that spring. It seemed like the right place for it. I don't know what came to this pond in January and February of that year. I know what I found. I know what happened on the ice. I know what was on the dock post the morning after, and I know what it meant, because the meaning was the only thing about any of it that was not in question. Something had been paying attention to this place for a while, and to the person walking it, and had decided at some point that he needed a hand. I was not in a position to argue. Cobb leaned against my leg the way he does, warm and solid in the cool morning, and the bread sat on the post, and the light kept coming.